Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar, Raising the Bar on Cross-Domain Security. My name is Marianne Santos-Spirito, the Marketing Coordinator at Owl, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. Today, our speakers will be Sean Campbell and Brian Hedquist from Owl. Sean has been securing software and systems throughout his career, with the last 10+ years focused on cross-domain solution technology and products. Brian is Owl's marketing director and has over 20 years experience in cybersecurity products and is responsible for Owl's CDS marketing activities. Before we start, please note that we'll answer all your questions at the end of this presentation. Use the question bar on the right-hand side of your screen to type in your questions. Now, I'd like to invite Sean in to get us started.
Thank you, Marianne. First off, we hope everyone's keeping safe in these difficult times, and thank you very much for spending the next hour with us. As Marianne mentioned, Brian Hedquist is the co-host today. All complaints go to him, and all compliments come to me.
Thanks, Sean. I appreciate that.
Oh, you're most welcome. Marianne mentioned the means to provide questions during this webinar. You are encouraged to keep that conduit busy. Some last-minute administrative comments. Since this is virtual, please feel free to take a break anytime you desire. Lastly, if you are averse to acronyms, buckle up. This webinar is a bountiful cornucopia of acronyms. We hope we break them all out, but if you have a particular question on any of them, send us a question. Let's get started and on with the show. Brian works closely with me to make sure we stay in touch on messaging and presentation of our product portfolio, while I work on ensuring our products meet our customers' needs. Lastly, excuse me, I already said all that. So Brian and I have been working for the last several months. For those that don't know, Owl Cyber Defense Solutions and Traces have merged over this past 6 months. And I'm originally from Owl, and Brian is originally from Traces, and like chocolate and peanut butter, we make a good match. And so now in the details of what we're talking about today. We are seeing very dynamic changes in the capabilities, motivation, sophistication, and availability of attack technologies, and attackers on computer systems and network infrastructure. And there's increasing momentum by the U.S. government to provide more cyber defense guidance and direction, aka governance, to address the threats and risks presented by attackers and their technologies. This webinar will provide you insight and information related to one key area of cyber defense guidance and direction, and that is cross-domain security. We will start at the roots of cross-domain security, how it started, where it came from, and follow that governance as it has evolved during the past 3 decades. Then we'll take a ride on the governance DeLorean back to the future and discuss how those roots have now grown into what is the ever-evolving or maturing Raise the Bar mandate. And lastly, we will cover some of the Raise the Bar's impact on you and your organization, and then a bit of self-examination as to how RTB has impacted Owl and what we are doing to address the RTB mandate. We hope we provide useful information to you so you can better understand cross-domain security, its governance, and its impact on today's market and your organization. For some of you, seeing the acronym CDS immediately brings up the textual image of cross-domain solutions. Today, we are taking a bit of a twist on that phrase to broaden the subject to be cross-domain security. Why are we doing that? Because governance is broadening beyond the technology that is used to create cross-domain solutions to encompass more of the infrastructure associated with those solutions. And so what do I mean by infrastructure? Infrastructure includes the governance, people, places, processes, technology that create, operate, use, and govern cross-domain solutions. Cross-domain solutions are composite technologies that are designed, implemented, and operated in accordance with the highest levels of rigor in order to securely provide organizations with the ability to manually and/or automatically access and/or transfer information between security domains. Security domains are the logical categorizations of the overarching organizational infrastructure that protects the content, data, information being processed, stored, or transferred. For example, you have top secret security domain, secret security domain, and unclassified security domain. Those are all well-known government security domains. That's not to say that you might have a particular private domain or segment that could follow and use all of the controls and capabilities of a cross-domain solution. Today, we will cover in greater detail security governance and how it's led to raising the bar on cross-domain security. During the 1980s and into early 1990s, the National Security Agency, NSA, to produce a set of guidance and criteria to securing technology like computers, databases, and networks, and to some degree, the infrastructures associated with that technology. The focus was primarily on computer security, or CompuSec. It was somewhat of a change for NSA as it had been heavily invested in the pursuit of communication security, ComSec, which has a heavy encryption notion to that form of security. And for some years, there was a lot of internal discussion as to the values of both approaches. The Rainbow series covered a broad range of topics: evaluation criteria, password management, environmental specifications, audit, security testing and evaluations, access control, network security, and on and on. But however, the most important part was the Trusted Computer System Evaluation Criteria, better known as the Orange Book. The Orange Book is really the root of cross-domain security. You still see the remnants of what it was and what it has come to be in today's governance and guidelines. It was formerly known as 5200.28, and what we'll see today also is that there were other guidance documents, such like the Trusted Network Interpretation, the TNI, which is the Red Book. There's also guidelines in there that have carried forward into what we're looking at today in cross-domain security and cross-domain solutions. The Orange Book identified multiple different levels of assurance categories, from an A1 down to a D1, which was minimal protection. The key item in the A1 notion was verified protection, and it involved formal methods and modeling like INAJO and GYPSY to truly have mathematical proofs of the security of the system. An example of that is GemSauce, which was from a company called Gemini, was an A1 OS that was used for a program called the Blacker program many years ago. A company called Rubix had a trusted Rubix implementation that was a B2 database. AT&T had a network card that was as a B1. And of course, the early Windows implementations were more at the C level, C1 level, and their early Unix implementations were at the C2 level. So you can see there's a broad range of technology from the A1 down to the C2 level. Most of the activities were government funded or derived from government funded activities. The market and government organizations' use of these standards and the technologies associated with them was slow to materialize. There was a common phrase in the 90s, C2 by 92. For all government computer systems. It sort of became part of the lexicon. With that, the milestone was never really being achieved. Tying this now back to cross-domain solutions and security. An early example of a solution that came out of the guidelines was the compartmented mode workstation, which was built on top of an OS called Trusted Solaris 8, and was, again, like a lot of these other things, was a government program out of DIA. Later in this time frame, still while all the governance is being produced for the Rainbow series, there was an additional document, more informal in nature, and it was an NSA security requirements document that really became the first guidelines for CDSs. and provided some early insight into the importance of filtering content that is being transferred through a CDS. We will see also how that document and those set of requirements have carried forward and actually being applied today. During these early 90s, which was sort of the end of the governance activity, or the production of Rainbow Series material, and there came to also be a notion of the power of two, not TWO, but TOO. Too long to market, too expensive to build, sell, too many resources, too long to evaluate, and just too. However, there were part of the reason of two was there was some good science and math involved behind the true rigor of this, which include things like formal methods that I mentioned earlier, and also the notion of covert channel analysis, which we're seeing more and more use of in these days, especially when we're looking at hardware vulnerabilities. At this time frame, there was increasing volumes for, well, we don't need absolute protection, we need good enough security. And so what we saw was a transition from this technology-centric approach to a more process-centric approach, and the first early notions of risk management. Heading into the early 2000s, we saw increasing emphasis on firewalls, intrusion detection systems, intrusion protection systems, and similar detect-react technologies with more emphasis on process controls than a one-type level of assurance. So what came out of that is directly related to the current cross-domain solutions and cross-domain security. The governance of the Orange Book really focused, as I said, on CompuSec. And so one of the early kings of the hill of CompuSec were this notion of trusted operating systems. Some of the earliest implementations of that were from Sun and from Honeywell. And what they became is the foundation of all CDSs you see today. Now they've evolved, but really the genesis came out of the notion of trusted operating systems. I also mentioned the fact that there was a little bit of a schism between good enough and absolute protection. And a lot of the principles of the absolute protection side carried forward into the creation and establishment of real-time operating systems. Green Hills and Wind River, also Lynx OS, were some early implementers of real-time operating system security. Things you will hear related to TOSs, or trusted operating systems, you'll hear terms like multi-level security, mandatory access control, and discretionary access control. You'll see a little bit more language associated with RTOS around the notion of multiple independent levels of security, or MILs, which is a true separation model where data does not go between each of the different, I'll call them stovepipes, that are separated with that enforcement model. So what was the genesis of this? Really, you'll see that this became the first sort of, I'll call it split of cross-domain security technologies, with cross-domain transfer really being, like I said earlier, associated with trusted operating systems, while cross-domain access solutions, and we'll talk a little bit more about those later, being more closely associated with real-time operating systems. So back to cross-domain security, we've covered a lot of the technology in the last few minutes. But in the latter 1990s and early 2000s, I talked about going from technology-centric to more process-centric activities. And with that, you'll see, I think it was around 1997, DoD defined and established the DoD Information Technology Security Certification and Accreditation Process, more commonly known as DITSCAT. And it's important to know that the Orange Book lived on. As we're talking about it, there's a thread of the Orange Book all the way to today. And it became the foundation security requirements for DITSCAT. In the meantime, the intelligence community was also looking at establishing processes for its community. And about, I think, 2003, the IC, Intelligence Community IC, established its National Information Security Certification and Accreditation Process, or NISCAP. Again, with its foundation also being the Orange Book, But what was established there was a new document called the Director of Central Intelligence DCI Directive 6/3. DCID 6.3 covered a lot of guidance related to the CNA of computer network and database systems, but it also including sort of the first level of categorization of how to provide an approval to operate or the level of security of a particular solution. And those were called protection levels. They were levels 1 through 5. And it's sort of in reverse notation here. The PL5 was the highest security connotation, while PL1 had the lowest. For example, you will see that PL5 and PL4 were commonly associated with cross-domain solutions or multi-level cross-domain access or transfer solutions, whereas PL3 was your general standard operating system like Unix or Windows or whatever the case may be. You saw that sort of start the separation between the evaluation needs of high rigor or high security technology like CDSs versus standard commercial off-the-shelf technology. Additionally, during this period, there was a Department of Defense instruction that was developed specifically for cross-domain solutions and more, a lot more related to where there were relationships or data flows or memorandum of understanding dealing with foreign partners, other national partners. But that never evolved past the draft status and became to become a formal standard. However, like those NSA security requirements that carry forward into that, some of the guidelines in that document have carried forward into current day governance. So those two process-oriented certification and accreditation processes evolved in their own right with new standards. Defense Information Assurance Certification and Accreditation Process, and the ICD 503, which was the Information Intelligence Community Directive, or CNA in of itself. The difference was that the ICD 503 became associated with NIST, at that time, the National Institute of Standards and Testing, which became technology, which is testing. But that was the first really federal, i.e. not associated with NSA or any of the intel communities, the first notion of security control requirements for federal information systems. So that was really, again, another derivative of the Orange Book. You'll see a lot of the language from Orange Book that carry forward into DCID 6.3, and that same language you can find within the NIST SP 800-53 security controls. The other item that came up about this time was a program, and again, too many acronyms here, but the National Security Telecommunications and Information Systems Security Committee, NCDSMO, now known as the Committee on National Security Systems, or CNSS, not quite the tongue twister, established its number 11 policy, or NCDSMO 11. And this was an acquisition document. And we'll see some of this carried forward into a notion, and we'll talk about more with CEDS guidance called baselines. But this was actually a standard stating that IA-enabled information technology products had to be acquired at certain degrees of certification or evaluation. And out of that came the Common Criteria Program, and that is in place even today. So Common Criteria had what they called EAL levels, 1 through 7, with the sort of the relationship of 7 being, if you could go back to the Orange Book, level 7 is somewhat equivalent to an A1, and of course D1 was more related to the notion of EAL1. But again, it's the level of rigor, and actually within Common Criteria, it identified the use of formal models in order to achieve EAL7 certification. So Common Criteria, even today, maintains a database of everything that's been evaluated. They do keep a notion of active certifications, and they archive those technologies that had prior certifications but have no longer maintained that certification. So when you're looking for technology products that were evaluated under common criteria, you'll see that notion. Now, unfortunately, the common criteria never carried forth really with CDSs as a product to be evaluated per se, mainly because the foundation for common criteria involved the notion of protection profiles, or security targets of evaluation. Those have never really carried forward too much within the CDS community. You will see the operating systems that are employed, the trusted operating systems that are employed in CDSs do go through the common criteria process within getting the evaluation. And generally speaking, most of the trusted operating systems are at a level called EAL4 plus. There's some additional capabilities added on to the base EAL4 evaluation. About this time, a little penguin appeared, and that was a new trusted operating system called SE Linux when combined with Linux itself. SE Linux was designed and started out of the NSA, again, a new key technology development out of NSA, and this transitioned into the mainline Linux distribution in 2003. Its maturation during the from that point on, 2003 to about 2005 or 6, started the notion of using it for cross-domain solutions. And so in the late 2000s, you started CDSs appear on the market using SE Linux as its trusted operating system. Today, this has led to SE Linux's transition to be the new king of the hill for trusted operating systems. It has become the predominant trusted operating system for cross-domain transfer solutions. Like the other processes that evolved, common criteria evolved, but I won't say evolved, but there was a split. As I talked about, there have been numerous splits, technologies and capabilities and even governance as we've gone through here to date. The NIAP was formed out of, I'll say it's a desire by the US government to really focus on the common criteria, not really fulfilling their needs based on the diversity of labs and the consistency of different labs that were doing evaluations. So the US government formed NIAP, the National Information Assurance Program, that very similar to common criteria, i.e. has protection profiles and it provides capability evaluations. And you'll see that carried forward, especially in the area beyond EAL2. So it's more your higher assurance evaluations will be conducted through the NIAP program, not the common criteria program, at least for technologies used by the US government. And again, similar to common criteria, you'll see the OSs have gone through that with their protection profiles, but you really won't see CDSs contained in those listings. And so continuing through the 2010s, we actually saw some additional augmentation of SP 800-53 with a particular document called the Committee for National Security Systems direction for 1253. The 1253s were a series of documents called overlays. And basically the overlay said, okay, here's the control on SP 800-53. It says you can do this, that, or another way to meet this particular requirement or control. CNSI 1253F, and attachment 3, more commonly called the CDS overlay, took that a step further. They said, no, you don't have the option for A, B, or C. You have to implement this control with this particular parameter, and that is the only way you can meet this requirement if you are CDS. So with the publication of the CDS overlay was really the first notion of requirements specific to CDSs since the NSA security requirements back in the 1990s. Again, that one draft policy, DoD draft policy, never carried forward to a formal standard. So you'll see the publication of that being applied to evaluations, again, going through NISCAP or NISCAP. Our evaluations of CDS is following those CDS overlay guidelines. A little bit after that came the formation of the first organization specifically tied to cross-domain solutions, and that was the Unified Cross-Domain Management Office. The Unified Cross-Domain Management Office, the initial charter was really to do a cataloging and assertion of exactly how many CDSs are out in the DoD and IC. Why do we have so many, and how do we go about reducing such a broad use of CDSs? Not so much from that the use wasn't needed, but so many diverse CDSs, it was hard to manage, control the quality and the goodness across so many different evaluation processes, i.e. DITSCAP and NISCAP. So how do we sort of consolidate all the CDSs under a common evaluation program so that we have consistency with all our CDSs? So it started out, I'll say, in the 2009-10 timeframe. And we also saw, as a result of the UCDMO activities and sort of this raising the awareness of what a CDS is and why do you need CDS and why do you need cross-domain security anyway, was the UCDMO conferences. Those were really the first major conferences geared for both government and commercial stakeholders, where a lot of interaction occurred between government and commercial stakeholders. These only lasted a few years, and with the general government reduction and cutting back sponsorship of conferences, these UCDMO conferences fell by the wayside and eventually evolved into a couple other activities that we'll cover here in a little bit. The UCDMO itself, again, transitioning and evolving, became the Unified Cross-Domain Services and Management Office in the mid-2010s, but didn't seem to get too much momentum into doing what the original charter and beyond, providing guidance, consolidating consistent guidance for the implementation and deployment of CDSs. And part of that was due to UCDMO and UCDSMO were based out of the Office of Director of National Intelligence, ODNI, and eventually senior level discussions when the government said, well, the charter of ODNI is really not an enforcement mechanism that's necessary to get these CDSs sort of corralled and on the path to improvement. So we're going to change the charter. And again, the charter came through this cross-domain policy document, DODI 8540.01. And we saw in the late 2010s the transition to what is now the National Cross-Domain Strategy and Management Office. And that is now based out of NSA and not ODNI. So with this transition to the NCDSMO, we saw the first publication of a document called the Cross-Domain Solution Design and Implementation Requirements, Raise the Bar Baseline. As I had mentioned in a slide earlier, is that the protection level notion and establishing quasi baselines like NCDSMO 11 did, with you had to be on this list or you couldn't be acquired and or used within the government. The Raise the Bar baseline really took over for what the UCDMO had established. The UCDMO had established what they called the UCDMO capabilities listing, which was the first such baseline for CDSs. And actually, you'll see language in the United States Munitions Act and listing of anything that was on that list was considered an ITAR solution. So that evolved, the UCL evolved into this new RTB baseline that we see today. The first version of Raise the Bar was published in December of 2018, version 1.0, and really became the guidelines for if you wanted to be used within the US government, you needed to meet these requirements. So during 2018 and 2019, we saw the evaluation processes take hold, and there were about 10 to 15 SCDS products listed on that baseline. All were deemed compliant with RTB baseline requirements, though not all necessarily addressed all of RTB baseline requirements. And we'll see that because to get the products out the door and to ensure that approved CDSs were available for existing and new mission requirements, there was great energy to try and get a defined set of CDSs out there and available for mission customers, both the Department of Defense and the intelligence community. What we also saw with the RTB is sort of the collation of a variety of different governance documents sort of being pulled under the auspices of the NCDSMO. So you started seeing something very similar to what we saw back in the 1980s and 90s, a whole suite of governance documents are now being produced and published and enforced for the cross-domain security community. So the cross-domain solutions themselves, and for those infrastructure elements, organizations, people, and processes associated with cross-domains. You saw this range of governance being published and that are continued to be published, meaning there's new documents under production even at this time. The notion of such documents as development and deployment timelines we'll cover a little bit more detail later, because you'll see that there's guidance in there that is applicable to organizations as to when and how and what they have to address for employing and deploying and operating CDSs within their government environment. So whereas the SP 800-53 had basically I won't call it a 50-50 split, but there are organizational requirements in SP 800-53, and there are technical requirements, i.e. information system requirements in SP 800-53. What you will really see in RTB, the baseline document itself is very much more oriented towards the technology or technical aspects, even though there are some organizational aspects. However, the one difference you'll see is in SP 800-53, you will see organization more in the context of government organization. The notion of organization, though you never really see that word within there, what you will see is vendor. So the focus of RTB is really to provide governance and direction to the vendors in how they build, produce, design, build, produce, and deploy CDSs to their customers. We'll cover here in the next slide or so that I wanted to bring up that first version of RTB. What it did was establish definitions, even though some had already been defined in prior documents. For example, there is a CNSI document called Information Assurance or Security Glossary. It has a lot of these definitions we've talked about today. But formally, RTB 1.0 called out different types of CDSs, different types of data being transferred through CDSs, and different characteristics of the data flow of that data as it's going through the CDSs. The focus is really on increasing the system assurance available with CDSs and the content filtering assurance. Again, going back to the NSA security requirements we saw in that first document in the late 90s. The RTB really defined a new approach to providing security assurance, both from a filtering and system assurance, and that was a concept called RAIN, and we'll cover that in the next slide. Basically, the RAIN concept is now the foundation for all CDSs moving forward, and we'll see how that is maturing in of itself and focusing changes in these documents as we go along. For example, RTB had 3 revisions within its first year of publication to ensure that new ideas, new techniques, new concepts were being incorporated by the CDS vendors as they produced and designed, developed, and produced their CDSs. We set the stage here with some more definitions, but really getting into that RAIN concept as we go along here. But first, remember I talked about there were different solution types. So earlier on, we talked about the king of the hill operating systems. There were trusted operating systems, real-time operating systems. RTB, though it addresses cross-domain access, which you use the RTOSs, it really doesn't go to the level or breadth or depth of requirements that we see for cross-domain transfer solutions. So a lot of what we'll be talking about in the coming slides is more oriented toward transfer solutions and not the cross-domain access solutions. Historically, there was a third type of CDS called a multi-level CDS, but within RTB, you're seeing that becoming a subset of CDS transfer type. And within the transfer type, we're seeing another couple types, subtypes of CDSs, software enforced and software and hardware enforced, as different design patterns for cross-domain transfer solutions within the RTB 1.0. So I just mentioned design patterns. So when I talk about software enforced, that is really referenced within cross-domain transfer design patterns as traditional software based, TSB, Tango Sierra Bravo. CDSs that are implemented in software, and that's why there's a notion of software enforcement that operate on trusted operating systems. In the past, there was Solaris 10 trusted extension, RHEL with Linux, and the other notion was BAE, or type of trusted OS was BAE stock OS. And this was actually a subset of the Honeywell solution that we developed way back in 1990s. So you're seeing not just the orange brick as far as governance carried forward, but you actually see technology carrying forward to today and still being used in the cross-domain transfer solutions. Somewhat the new kid on the block from a design pattern point of view with cross-domain transfer is really the first formal identification of combining the TSB capabilities, the software enforced capabilities, with hardware enforced capability. That is through the notion of technologies such as data diodes, whether they might be optical diodes or FPGAs or other passive types of CyberTAP diodes. It's all hardware based with the notion that what goes through it can't come back, meaning it's a true one-way implementation of a data flow. And NSA has actually established sort of in peer with the NCDSMO's labs for testing for baseline CDS baseline compliance. They've actually started up a diode technology lab and evaluation validation process to validate the quote-unquote one-wayness of those one-way data diodes. Additionally, in RTB, it has identified there's really 2 environments that will where CDSs will be employed: data centers and tactical environments. Data centers are looked at as more controlled environments where CDSs are deployed in an environmentally controlled closed room that with standard racks to empower air for the CDSs. Whereas the tactical environment is definitely not really a controlled environment overall, because you see ruggedized vehicles like MRAP vehicles or Humvees, or it might be on an aircraft or a ship, where the CDSs are going where they have to be able to survive in harsh, environmentally harsh, or even contested wartime type of environments. You see some overlap because even in wartime, in the combat or excuse me, command posts or forward operating bases, you'll actually see data center environments, meaning a closed environment that has environmental controls. So you will see some data center CDSs being deployed in tactical environments, but just in a controlled, conditioned space. The last thing I want to cover on this slide is the data flows. Within RTB, you see the notion of structured data, meaning it's well-defined data, i.e., you know which is in what kind of content, how long, how many characters are in that content, or the actual byte structure of a particular field, something that can be evaluated. But then there's the other notion of unstructured data, where anything could really be in that content. A good example is that 2007 Word type I brought up earlier with the notion of that complex data flows going through the system. So you'll see things like Office documents, PDF files, imagery, things of that nature being included unstructured data, meaning that they can embed objects, they can have content in white space, very unstructured. So it takes a significant different type of filtering capability to deal with that unstructured data. Really, this is the true evolution of where those initial filtering requirements came out of in the late 90s. The last couple kinds of data I'll talk about is streaming data. And that can be either like video or voice or even web services going through where there's a low latency requirement and is really not designed to have the same level of and complexity of filtering that is done on the complex data types that I previously mentioned. Now that we've gone quite all the way through with the different types and definitions, here's where we start focusing on cross-domain transfer and the concepts like RAIN within RTB. Not like the Alien and Men in Black, a cross-domain transfer system is really basically, I got somebody sending data, I need somebody receiving data, and I'm just filling the different queues or boxes with that content as it's being processed through the cross-domain transfer solution. RAIN actually got its start, and this goes back again to the 90s, to a couple of concepts, both the NSA's defense in depth concept and also one of its concepts called NEAT. NEAT was non-bypassable, evaluatable, always invoked, and tamper-proof. And this, again, because of its history, was more geared toward the encryption crypto world and ComSec. Both of those, defense in depth and NEAT, have been incorporated now into RAIN, and you'll see almost some of the same words, is redundant, meaning that filters and domain separation are invoked twice within the solution, or the pipelines, as we're talking about, as data is processed through the cross-domain transfer solution. Always invoked, which is exactly the same from what was from NEAT. Independent implementations. No two filters should be alike kind of aspect, meaning that I have a filter that does this on content coming from the source, and I want to do the same kind of filtering, but I need a different implementation just to make sure that if that first filtering capability is compromised, and someone won't already then have the keys to the kingdom with the second filter that's employed in that pipeline. We actually, independent implementations carry forward not just from the technology, but even that different developers should be used to develop different implementations, just to make sure that maybe an error made by developer A as he's doing filter A doesn't carry forward with when he's doing filter B. And so you use different people for developing different filters. And non-bypassable, again, another neat concept carried forward, is really not to have anything, any filter that's in the pipeline be bypassed, so you don't have a chance for error an opening within the pipeline itself where not all the right filtering has been done on the content. We'll sort of go quickly through the following slides. Just want to give you an idea as the detailed levels of requirements, but not the details themselves. For those details, you can always go to the document and review for yourself. The point I wanted to make here was as I've sort of emphasized on and on again, one of the NCDSMO's big benefits is being able to talk to all communities, both users and vendors, and taking the concepts, ideas, techniques, and technologies from different vendors and sort of getting them integrated into RTB. And I think that's one reason why you see the frequent updates of those mandates and requirements, because the NCDSMO is constantly learning better ways to increase the assurance of cross-domain solutions. So a lot of these categories that you see here are direct descendants of the same types of categories that you saw or that you would see if you were looking at the Rainbow series. One of the other things I want to mention here down at the platform security, the last one, is that for the first, not the first time, but for actually a broader statement, the security of the CDS is not just the software, it's not just the diodes, but it's the platform itself. And you'll see a transition to ensuring that the hardware platform itself, whether it's COTS or not, employs common best of industry standards like the Trusted Platform Module, TPM 2.0. In fact, here at Owl, we're calling that making sure the hardware platforms are RTB ready, meaning that they meet all these hardware requirements and they're able to host an RTB compliant software platform, provide an overall RTB compliant solution. And I sort of mixed up the slides here a bit, started giving you a preview before we actually got to it. But here's where we start talking about the different data types, as we talked about earlier. And what I wanted to go into is this notion of inspection and sanitization guidance. It's one of those documents now under the portfolio of the NCDSMO from an overall aspect. And those guidance documents are driving where filter capabilities are going. A good example of this is the Microsoft Office 2007 guide. And then, yes, there are Office versions earlier and later, but I just wanted to give you a view of this. And in fact, there's a little bit of trivia here. Even though this is listed as a 2010 document, it was updated in 2017. And you can see all of these documents at the web link below. They're actually hosted on the NSA site. But I want to go a little bit more detail into filtering on just a couple aspects. We talked about complex data, unstructured data, structured data, but I want to bring up the notion of filter orchestration and the concept within RTB of recursive decomposition. And that is when you have a complex document like Microsoft Office, you can embed PowerPoint, Excel, all kinds of different sub-data types into that document. And what filter orchestration does through recursive decomposition is extract all those objects and inspect each individual object itself to decide whether they pass or fail the policies defined for what is good in that document, and potentially even sanitize some of that, meaning sanitize, they remove the object if it's fails, or there are some implementations that can actually make some changes to content, and then it puts it all back together into a readable document. So that's a very sophisticated and complex type of filtering, and we're seeing particular COTS filter engines being used to do that kind of recursive decomposition. So it's available both in the commercial market, but it's being heavily applied in the cross-domain market. The last item I really want to cover, last two items I want to cover on this is the concept of data normalization, denormalization. That is, it's been determined that extensible markup language, XML, is a good format and an inspectable format for content. So, but there's not everything's in XML format. So data normalization, denormalization is a process that goes to transform structured or semi-structured data into sometimes even binary data into XML representation so that it can be filtered by these well-known and well-constructed XML filters. And the last time on this is historically, video going through cross-domain transfer systems is really just a straight-through pass-through. You might be filtering on the metadata associated with the video, the key link value metadata. But now similar to what we're talking about getting data into XML format, video has to go through transcoding processes to help reduce the potential harm for steganography, and that might be embedded within the video. And lastly, as far as the requirements go, the lifecycle requirements. And you saw some of this within the Rainbow series, like trusted distribution of computers or computing, trusted computers. That were, again, carrying forward even beyond the SP800-53, beyond the CDS overlay. There are new requirements, much more detailed, relating to the certification of CDSs, physical security associated with CDSs, supply chain risk management, a lot more detailed requirements. So consistent with what we talked about before is at the top level, you have the SP800-53, you have the CDS overlay, and now you have the overlay of the overlay, which is really the RTB requirements we talked about throughout the last several slides. Going really quickly through this. This is just to give you a snapshot view of the process that CDSs have to go to be approved for use to get onto the baseline. It starts with your cross-domain support element, and this is where some of the impact on you as an organization or as an individual or even as a vendor encounter is you've got to get your CDS into the baseline, whether it's a new implementation or a significant change to your current approved CDS. It still has to go through the same baseline and through the NCDSMO labs, which are called, which conduct lab-based security assessments, or LBSAs. So it goes through this process and eventually comes out at the end with an approved for the baseline, and we'll go on the baseline. This can be covered in a separate discussion, but I just wanted to give you the many steps just to get the CDSs on the baseline. And once they're on the baseline, then there's a whole process of getting it deployed in your environment. And with that, you have different timelines. Just so many years for the development and test cycle, and then so many years for the deployment cycle, and then everything goes sunset, and you have to start the process again. So all these things are going in circles and all interacting with each other. I mentioned RTB, those published guidelines at the end of 2018. A new one just came out in January of 2020. That's phase 2. So as an organization, you've got to be prepared to start deploying the phase 1 solutions by the end of this year. So you're already technically gotten through the development test cycle, and there's some misalignment of some of this guidance. But it's important to know that you need to be aware of all these interacting deployment schedules and releases of RTB baseline so that you aren't caught behind the wheel, asleep at the wheel with these different technologies. Really quick, Owl's addressing RTB through a couple different areas. As I mentioned earlier, our hardware devices are diodes, so we have a variety of different diodes. And they are currently in the diode testing lab at NSA to be quote, approved for use in RTB solutions. The second aspect is our RTB solutions themselves. I talked about the hardware, being able to run different software. So we have data center platforms, we have tactical platforms, all will run our CDS software. We really have two families of CDS software, our ITAR version, which is XD Bridge, and our XD Guardian version, which is exportable. And is not ITAR controlled. It is actually going to be one of the first CDSs under the Missile Defense Agency's Foreign Military Sales Program. Our solutions are really being structured along two different types, streaming and file types. So our streaming solutions deal with the structured data or semi-structured data. They deal with fixed format, and they also deal with video that we talked about before. Our file solutions are really where we talked about the filter orchestration. We're dealing with the recursive decomposition and complex data. They will also do fixed format and structured, but again, because it goes through the filter orchestration and the complex data filters, that the latency is not as controlled as our streaming solutions. But our streaming solution starts our LBSA in Q3. We've already got a defined lab, so it's really the Gen 2 of our XD Bridge solution. Our Gen 1 is already on the baseline. And to meet these new RTB requirements, our Gen 2 will be, like I said, in June. We're already going through the diode testing. Our XD Guardian is actually for the MDA implementation, is in process of LBSA and on the latter half of its LBSA. And then our tactical solutions, of course, are going through mill, as we see right now, going through mill standard testing. So all this is the impact it has had on Owl. We've had to redesign, all the CDS vendors. I've had to resign, going to a new generation of CDS capabilities, and you'll see us start adding to our portfolio line items onto the baseline. So thank you, everyone, for your time and patience. I'd like to thank my colleague Brian Hedquist and the marketing team for the hard work. And if there are any questions, I think Brian, you might have a few questions.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. That was really interesting. We do have a few questions. Let me just jump right in. Yeah, we're almost, our time is almost up, so let me get right to these. So the first question is, how long does it take for a product to get approved to be on the NCDSMO baseline, and what kind of costs may be associated with that?
I'll go a little bit into the timeline. You're seeing at a very optimistic being over 4 months, but generally it's 6 months or so for that LBSA pipeline of testing that I had showed you on the one slide. And that's without any regression testing, meaning any significant findings that would have to go back through a design cycle and circle back through all those steps within that LBSA process. The cost is variable. Because there's a cost if it's a government organization, and there's a cost if there's a commercial organization being the sponsor of the solution going through that process. So that is variable. A lot of it can depend on the quality and the completeness of the documentation that is presented. So the more complete document and the more quality of the documents, that can reduce the cost going through that process. But I don't have a defined value.
Okay, great, thanks. Next question. Are there any other RTB compliant filtering patterns other than the one you mentioned?
There's always the potential for more, but at this time, really they're talking about structured data, which could be various many subtypes of that, or the unstructured data, like complex data. I would think the one thing I didn't talk about was there's some growth required in the area of filtering pipelines for audio. So you'll see some growth in that area. And I think as more data types are created, the complex data may evolve into different filtering patterns also.
Okay. Let's see. Do you guys, sorry, does Owl have any data center devices on the baseline at this time?
So what is on there currently is the XD Bridge solution that's on there right now. It's a file transfer solution, and it's being used within the DoD and the IC. And that is currently what's on the baseline.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. So, excuse me, we heard a lot of different terms about RTB. What does RTB-Ready mean?
So I covered that a little bit. It's a term, a coined phrase here at Owl. They're really, because we build our own hardware platforms as well as use COTS platform, other vendor platforms like Dell and HP and such. But really it's to say that it meets the hardware requirements identified within RTB for both data center and tactical platforms. A good example for tactical platforms is that we employ self-encrypting drives for full disk encryption to meet that requirement.
Okay. And I think we're almost out of time, so I'll ask one last question. There are still a few others in the queue, but what we can do with those is reach out to you through email to answer those questions after the webinar is over. But let me get this last one. You mentioned the difference between software enforced and software and hardware enforced solutions. Is one better than the other, or should one be used for a specific application?
There's the notion of a particular use case where high threat networks are involved, where it's being really considered and defined to use hardware enforcement at that touch point when it's touching a high threat network. Software enforced solutions provide much more flexibility, meaning that they can support a software enforced solution can support multiple domains, not just 2 domains as you see typically with a hardware enforced solution. So that's a primary discipline. It's the flexibility and the expansion capabilities of software enforced runaway transfers versus hardware. The only other primary difference is with software enforced, you do have the ability for bidirectional flows that can be controlled by software enforced, but that is exactly what a hardware enforced solution is designed to prevent, is bidirectional through a one-way diode. So those are the primary differences. One, they have different use cases.
Okay, that sounds good. And I just want to reiterate, there's a few more questions, but we can respond to those by email follow-up after the webinar. And with that, I think we've hit our time. I'm going to turn it back over to Mary Ann for just closing.
Great, thank you, Brian and Sean. Okay, so yeah, we're out of time, and as Brian had mentioned, those questions that hadn't been answered, we will reach out to you directly to answer those for you. I'd like to thank you again for joining us today. Everyone who registered will receive an email providing you access to the webinar, so don't worry about that if you've missed something or if you want to look back on what was talked about today. Also, you can get this, this is available live chat on our website, and that can also assist you with any questions you may have or any needs that you have as well. And one more thing, just please check your emails for invites for more great OWL webinars that will be coming soon. All right, take care everyone and be safe.